Now, in the last lecture, I explained why we sometimes need more dynamic websites where we have code that resides on a server, on the so-called backend, that then is able to, for example, generate the HTML code that will be sent back dynamically. Because it is crucial to understand that as a web developer, it of course is about bringing something onto the screen of your visitors, about building that website your visitors see, but you'll have two options for building that. Option A is that you write the instructions yourself, that you write all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code your users will see yourself, and it's exactly the same code for every visitor. And often that's the right option because often you have websites where every visitor should see the same website, where every visitor should see the same result. For example, if you're building your own portfolio page or something like the tic-tac-toe game where we have the same website for every visitor. But we also have more dynamic websites in the web where the content that is being displayed to a visitor is not the same for every visitor. That's why we also have another option, option B, where as a web developer, we don't write all the HTML and CSS and JavaScript code ourselves, but instead we might prepare pieces of it, but then we write code that runs on the server that generates the HTML code that will be sent back dynamically. And that's this second approach which you saw in action at the example of Amazon, but of course there are other websites which need this kind of behavior as well. And of course, throughout this course, in the upcoming sections and with all the examples you see there, you will learn when to use which option and you will get a feeling for how to decide which option is best. For the moment, it is just important to recognize that we have these two options and that we basically have these two ends when we talk about web development. We have the so-called front-end, which is basically the code that executes directly in the browser of your visitors and therefore in the end on the machines, the computers of your visitors. That's this code that controls what the user sees. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are the languages you use for writing that code. And as mentioned before, you either write that code yourself or you write code that generates this front-end code just in time dynamically. If you go for option B, you have so-called backend code as part of your overall website. That's the code that executes directly on the server, so on the computer owned by you, the website owner, which serves the website, and there you might then not just be serving the finished HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, but instead you might have extra code that executes on that machine that generates those instructions, that generates the HTML code specifically dynamically. So here you then have some extra logic on the server and you can do some behind the scenes work where you, for example, load data from a database to prepare the HTML code that will be sent back. Now, you can also do more work on the backend. You can, for example, also store incoming data that's being sent from a user, for example, if some form is submitted, even if you then do send back a standardized HTML page as a response. But we'll see all of that in action over the next sections, no worries. So it's this backend where you can do data parsing and storage, fetch data, store files, and do all these things that need to happen on a central machine, which is the same for all visitors. Because, for example, when it comes to uploading profile images, you need to store these images on your own machine, which belongs to you, the website owner, because otherwise not all visitors would be able to see that image. I hope that makes sense. Now, therefore, as a web developer, you can work on either the front end, so on the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code, or the backend, so the code that runs on the server, and we'll have a look at which programming languages we can use there in just a second. But you can also work on both. Then you are a so-called full-stack web developer who's doing full-stack web development, because then you are working on both what the user sees and what happens on the server. And whilst specializing may have the advantage of being able to dive deeper into the specific languages and features, knowing both, of course, has the advantage that you can build a complete website, even if it happens to be a dynamic website, completely on your own. Which is especially useful if you are working as a freelancer or if you are building a website for your own business, which might need such a dynamic website. In this course, you will of course learn both. Both fields are covered in depth, and whilst we did focus on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and therefore the front-end part up to this point, from now on we will also dive deeply into the backend and see how both ends are connected in the end.